Hello, I'm Ramjee Chandran and this is the History of Bangalore. Welcome to episode 41 of season 1. And this is part 6 of my series on the Hoysalas. Things are about to get heated up with the arrival of Vishnuvardhana on the scene. In 1108, he took over from his older brother, Balala I, who died without an heir. Well, that's the recap, and it is also the setup for the reign of Vishnuvardhana, who turned the promise of an empire into an empire. And all that history comes up right after you give me a moment to thank my sponsors, the Prestige Group, whose patronage makes this podcast possible. Building cities one landmark at a time, they transform dreams into reality. You can be a part of the future. Simply add prestige to your life. When Balala I had died without an heir, the throne passed naturally to the second oldest sibling, Vishnuvardhana. Now, Vishnuvardhana, whose original name was Bittiga or Bittideva, had been loyal and faithful to his brother. So much that inscriptions compared him to the famous younger brother of the Ramayana, Lakshmana, who is said to have done much of the work but remained completely devoted to his older sibling. Also surviving was the youngest brother, Udayaditya, although he would die during the reign of Vishnuvardhana. About this third brother, there's nothing much that has been said about Udayaditya, but in what little has been said, one thing stands out, that he is known as the builder of Srirangapatna in or around 1120 AD. Now, according to the Mysore Gazetteer, this was mentioned in a late 19th century Kannada manuscript titled The History of the Ancient Temples at Halebeed, authored by one Shivananda Gowda. According to R. Narasimhachar, the compiler of the 1907 Mysore Archaeological Report, Gowda's manuscript had been vetted by experts and it had passed the smell test. Significantly, the year mentioned, 1120 AD, tells us that Udayaditya had the mandate to build Srirangapatna or anything else in the Gangavadi because his brother Vishnuvardhana had by then conquered the entire Gangavadi. And this brings us to the reign of Vishnuvardhana, the most significant of Hoysala rulers by any measure. There are two distinct periods of Vishnuvardhana's rule. First, a period of quiet when nothing happened. And following that, a period when there was no quiet at all. And it was all war after war, battle after battle, on steroids. And at any point in time, some blunt stratagem was being pursued to expand the empire. Vishnuvardhana came to the throne in 1108. There's some quibble about the year, but not materially, so I will stick with the majority opinion, 1108. The summary of his reign is this. He ruled for 34 years, and it was a reign filled with relentless military campaigns, except for that little period I mentioned. His most visible successes were the campaigns against the Choras to take over Talakadu, which he succeeded in doing, and the other major objective was to break free from the Chalukyas. Now, in the second objective, he didn't quite manage to succeed entirely, but did manage to loosen their grip and shake things up. But the success that we must most credit him with is that he elevated the Hoysala territories to the status of a kingdom. And the foundation he created became the springboard for his successors, who would go on to transform the empire into a larger empire and become one of the most powerful empires in South India. Let's cycle through these years. When Vishnuvardhana ascended the throne, the principal players in the Deccan were Vikramaditya VI of the Chalukyas, and on the Chora throne was Kulotanga I, who was born Rajendra Chora. Now, there were no headlines in the first 8 years of Vishnuvardhana's reign. It was that period of quiet. But in reality, it is hard to accept that there was any period of quiet at all for a man as restless and driven as Vishnuvardhana. So the question that one must ask is, what was brewing? And it just might turn out there was indeed one thing that changed during this reflective period that might have influenced the rest of his reign, and that relates to religion. That change was when Vishnuvardhana converted from Jainism to Vaishnavism. And this was not a small matter for the time, and much has been said about the event, and it deserves our attention. The Hoysalas were traditionally Jains, and they had been very true to their faith. But all kings and kingdoms of the south were known to be secular between Jainism and the other faiths that arrived with the many merchants and traders who all would have been found commonly across the Deccan, traditionally Muslims, Jews, Christians, the older Indian faiths, Buddhism, and of course the two principal sects of Hinduism, Shaivism and Vaishnavism. The exception to the kings of the south was some of the Choras who were staunch in their Shaivism to the point of intolerance. One of those was said to be Kulotunga. One day, a visitor arrived in Vishnuvardhana's kingdom. He had fled his home and came to take refuge from persecution by the Choras, and this was a Tamil Brahmin Vaishnava Acharya from Sri Perambuddur, Ramanuja, who was a philosopher and a social reformer, and by what seems like consensus, the greatest of Vaishnava scholars ever. The life of Ramanuja is the subject of much study and books, and I cannot do any justice to all that in a couple of minutes. But again, to not mention him would be a mistake, because how he influenced Vishnuvardhana, and by that, the history of Gangavadi, which is our history. So, the background of how he got to the Hoysala kingdom is not only material, but terribly important. Ramanuja was the disciple of Yadava Prakasha of the Advaita Vedanta school of philosophy of Shankaracharya. But Ramanuja diverged from his guru on the non-dualistic philosophy of Advaita Vedanta, the interpretations of Upanishads being the main bone of contention between them. Ramanuja chose instead to align with the devotional traditions of the Tamil Alvars and the teachings of scholars like Nadamuni and Yamunacharya. Ramanuja grew up in typical Tamil society during the Chora dynasty. The time that he grew up was a time of religious diversity, where Vaishnava, Shaiva, Smarta, Buddhist and Jain traditions all thrived side by side. But Advaita Vedanta was the dominant Hindu philosophy during that period. Now, even before Ramanuja, the Vaishnava traditions were already pretty well established under Yamunacharya, and the devotional songs of the Tamil Alvars were very well known. But what set Ramanuja apart was his challenge to Shankara's Advaita philosophy, and he became famous as the first thinker in centuries to offer a new interpretation of the Upanishads. Now, no prizes for guessing that his leaning towards Vaishnavism would have led to some ideological differences with the ruling Choras. But was Ramanuja persecuted and driven out of Sri Perambuddur by Kulotunga Chora? The only source of that story appeared in hagiographies or biographies centuries afterwards. And historian Nilakanta Shastri was dismissive of the legends of persecution faced by Ramanujas and his followers in all details, and said that he wasn't fully trusting of those stories. Besides, in their time, the Choras are known to have built several Vaishnava temples. So the possibility that Ramanuja was run out of town by the order of a Chola emperor based on principles seems unlikely. But again, there's no ruling out a personal animosity between ruler and Acharya, and these things are often poorly documented. But there was some legend that relates to the Chora ruler asking for everyone, including Ramanuja, to sign a paper acknowledging the superiority of Shaivism, and that Ramanuja had justifiably refused. Now again, these stories can tend to be a little far-fetched if you just step back and think about it for a minute. But nonetheless, persecution or enmity, Ramanuja found that he did need to relocate to the Hoysala kingdom, and he did so towards the end of the 11th century, sometime around 1098 AD, and he would return home to Srirangam only around 1122 after the passing of his king that had persecuted him so much. It was during his time in the Hoysala kingdom that the fateful meeting happened between Bittideva or Vishnuvardhana and Ramanuja. Ramanuja turned out to be a great influence on him, an influence so great that it did change the course of history in the Deccan. The stories of Vishnuvardhana's conversion to Vaishnavism are many and compelling, But it's time now for a commercial break, and I will return to these stories right after this.
Maximum connectivity, maximum luxury, maximum lifestyle. Live your max at Prestige Raintree Park. Opulent residences nestled in 21 acres of breathtaking landscape with 1 lakh plus square feet of clubhouse, 3 swimming pools, and ample leisure and sports amenities. Experience exquisite living at Prestige Raintree Park in prime Whitefield with schools, offices, hospitals, and shopping malls just a hop away. Call 81399 81399 or visit prestigeconstructions.com to know more. RERA approved.
Hi, I'm back with the story of how Ramanuja Acharya converted Vishnuvardhana to Vaishnavism. In this, Vishnuvardhana had another great influence in his life who was encouraging him to go with Ramanuja, and that was his wife, Shantala Devi. Now, there are some minor conflicting accounts as to whether she was a Jain or a Vaishnava, but there is compelling evidence, even after the date of Vishnuvardhana's conversion to Vaishnavism, that Shantala Devi remained a Jain until she died in 1131. And there are some other stories. Now, as can be expected, one of the stories includes how the Acharya cured Vishnuvardhana's daughter of a deadly disease by giving her tulsi leaves and sprinkling her with holy water. Now, I'm going to quickly move past this because supernatural curing of mystery illnesses was a recurring theme at the time, and it keeps cropping up every now and again in history, twice in Ramanuja's case. But one of the tales that stands out more than the others was recounted in the Mackenzie collection and a few other places. During this time, Vishnuvardhana had started to feel unsettled with the Jain Acharyas. He had been receiving accounts of the Jain Munis becoming arrogant and unaccountable, and he was growing tired of them. He saw the Jain Gurus as corrupt and also felt that their teachings didn't suit the challenges of the day. Now, to make matters worse, there were accounts of what appears to be sexual impropriety. And this was on an inscription dating back to 1118, found in Nagamangala. The inscription both accuses and then immediately defends the Jain Yati or Muni, Vinayanandi Deva, saying first that he went among the women devotees, and then that he would never do that. And I quote from the inscription, "Listen to this one thing, ye learned, you yourselves being ever the witnesses, he treated the group of women as he would the wife of his father." First, the phrase wife of his father rules out mother. It would have referenced another, logically later, wife. Next, it stands to reason that the inscription writer would not have ventured this tidbit merely as a piece of gossip unless there was something to it. And it is understandable that he tried to soften things up and offer gratuitous editorialization, suggesting that the Muni would not have treated women differently from his father's wife, which, as I said, clearly is not how one describes a mother. So I'm not sure that this didn't actually make things worse. And then a Jain Muni, and I'm assuming this was a different one, added insult to everything by refusing to eat at Vishnuvardhana's palace because the king was missing a finger. And Jain tradition forbade the Munis from receiving food from someone who had a physical defect. Now, when seen in the light of Ramanuja, who showed by his actions that he was a sincere reformer, deeply invested in the welfare of the people, Vishnuvardhana started gravitating towards the Vaishnava and then took steps to completely embrace the new faith. Now, this unsettled the Jain cabal considerably, and by the order of the day, they challenged Ramanuja to a debate. The debate was held in the court. Now, these events drew considerable public interest, and it was the intellectual equivalent of a duel or a joust. Word of this debate, we can assume, spread through the kingdom, and it would have attracted the presence of scholars and many interested people from right across the kingdom. The debate raged for 18 days. There is not any epigraphical record of the content of the debate in any material sense, and I'm going to skip past fantastic hagiographies on the subject. But there are accounts that Ramanuja's arguments stood firm in the debates against the Jain philosophers. In short, the Jains could not stand up to Ramanuja's debating skills. One account suggested that they were ill-prepared for the debate and did not have a good grip on their own texts, the underlying message being that they had become complacent and out of touch with their own humility. But events like this spark off all sorts of fanciful tales, and in this case, there were stories of atrocities that Ramanuja and Vishnuvardhana had perpetrated on the Jains. These included stories like the two tearing down a whole bunch of Jain basadis and building a great tank in their place. But the worst account is how Vishnuvardhana, at Ramanuja's insistence, ordered the Jain theologians who had lost the debate to be ground down in oil mills. Now, this sounds astonishingly cruel to the point of the king being psychopathic, and it is probably entirely untrue and a matter of hyperbole. It was more likely an analogy that was used during the day of Ramanuja's prowess in debate, where he ground down in the mill of his logic the arguments of his rivals, and it didn't really say that he pulped them, human beings, flesh and bone all together in an actual oil mill. Another reason this so-called oil mill affair was likely nothing more than an exaggerated tale, because even if Ramanuja had tried to get Vishnuvardhana to do it, Vishnuvardhana wouldn't have allowed it, if not out of compassion, then certainly for political reasons. With his wife, his daughter, his top generals like Gangaraja and Mariane, and his councillors all being Jains, it would have been reckless for him to act otherwise. This story actually was developed more as a boastful claim of victory, and it was crafted not by later generations of Jains, but later generations of Vaishnavas. Besides all this, while Vishnuvardhana, whose name is that, by the way, only after he converted, it was Pittiga or Pittideva until then, so while he did everything that he could to promote the Vaishnava faith, there is enough evidence of the number of grants he had made to the Jains. Also, Vishnuvardhana had made a grant to the Shaiva temple on Chamundi Hill, and he accepted the prasada offered by the Jains after the consecration of the Jinalaya at Halebid, and he honored a Jain scholar, Sri Pala Trividyadeva, and appointed him as a tutor to his own children. It was also around this time that the Veerashaiva or Lingayat sect began to rise, and this led to simultaneous challenges to Jainism from the Vaishnavas in the south and the Veerashaivas in the north. But the way the Hoysalas, both rulers and ministers, managed these competing sects stands as an example of how tolerant was the religious policy that existed in their day. Now, what was the effect on history of Vishnuvardhana's conversion to Vaishnavism? One is that it precipitated the end of Jain power. The rise of the Lingayats, which was reflected in the rich literature of the time, likely played a role in the decline of Jainism. Harassed by the Choras and facing relentless questioning and ridicule from the Shaivas, the Jains were already struggling. Ramanuja's influence and Vishnuvardhana's conversion to Vaishnavism dealt that final blow. From this point in history, Jainism's influence began to fade. And by the late 13th century, the Jains had dwindled to a small community centered around Shravanabelagola, which remains to this day a significant Jain hub in South India. But during the Hoysala period, though, Jainism was still a living, breathing religion, even though it was facing periods of decline, and the Jains were too powerful to ignore. But after Vishnuvardhana's conversion, it likely lost its status as the state religion. The other effect of the conversion was that Vishnuvardhana seems to have shaken off his passivity. His conversion seems to have changed something within him. Maybe he had found a new passion that had breathed a new energy into him, for almost immediately he began to make plans for the expansion of the kingdom. For generations, the Hoysalas, including Vishnuvardhana, had served their overlords, the Western Chalukyas, as governors of Gangavadi. And as I mentioned in previous episodes, it was only a part of the Gangavadi that had been carved out from Chora control. And in his goal towards domination of the Deccan, Vishnuvardhana's first target was the rest of Gangavadi. To quote Benjamin Lewis Rice, during the 200 years that intervened from the capture of Talakadu by the Choras, and their overthrow of the Ganga kingdom to the time when the Hoysalas acquired possession of them, a period of anarchy prevailed. With his newfound faith, his newfound energy and resolve, it was in 1116 AD that Vishnuvardhana, assisted by his key generals, launched a decisive attack on Gangavadi. It is unclear why so many years went by before Vishnuvardhana got back his belligerence and ambition. Maybe it was the depression following the bad defeat in the Hoysalas' first stab at independence. But the effect of the conversion of Vishnuvardhana to the new faith was by all accounts the fulcrum on which the history of the South Deccan turned. And now that he had his groove back, Vishnuvardhana had been unleashed. In the next episode, the Battle of Talakadu and Vishnuvardhana's expansion on steroids as the rest of his reign is a blur of battles and conquests. There is a lot of excitement in store, and all that is coming very soon. I am Ramjee Chandran, and this is the History of Bangalore.